I always thought the vastness of the desert would calm me. It was what I needed after everything that had happened at work. The constant pressure, the unrelenting deadlines, the suffocating feeling of being boxed into the same routine. I planned the trip to Big Bend National Park months ago, thinking a week away from it all would clear my head. Solitude in the desert seemed like the perfect way to hit the reset button. I'd heard the stories, of course, rumors of spiritual significance, whispered legends passed down by native tribes, but I had never put much stock in that kind of thing. They were just stories, right? I was wrong. Big Bend is a place where the land meets the sky in such a dramatic way that it's almost unnerving. The sun bakes the earth by day, and at night, the stars stretch endlessly, a canopy of light over the barren landscape. The silence is deafening, and out here, far away from everything, it feels like the world is holding its breath. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the distant Chizos Mountains. My plan was simple: hike the trail to the window, a spot famous for its breathtaking sunset views. I'd set up camp, spend the night there, and continue deeper into the wilderness the next day. A week alone, away from the noise of civilization. I'd been craving this. Everything seemed perfect at first. The air was dry and warm, the trail rugged but manageable, and my gear was top-notch, a mix of high-end camping equipment and essentials I'd collected over the years. I felt prepared, confident, ready to let the desert cleanse my mind. But that feeling didn't last. By the time I reached my campsite, I noticed my GPS was flickering, the signal coming and going without explanation. I chalked it up to a glitch. Maybe the battery was low, though I had checked it before I left. Then my phone started to act strangely. The battery, which had been at 80% when I arrived, drained rapidly, dropping to 20% in just a few minutes. No big deal, I thought. I wasn't here to use my phone. After all, this was supposed to be my escape from technology. As I set up my tent, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the cold wind swept through the canyon. I hadn't expected the temperature to drop so quickly, and I fumbled through my pack for my jacket. My hands were shaking, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. That's when I heard it. The first sign that something wasn't right. It was faint at first, just a whisper carried on the wind, so soft I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, rhythmic, almost like chanting, echoing through the canyon. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear. There was nothing, just the sound of the wind. "Get it together, Tyler," I muttered to myself. I was overthinking things again. The wind through the rocks, that's all it was. My mind was playing tricks on me, feeding into my anxieties like it always did. I finished setting up camp and tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. The silence was oppressive, heavy, as if the desert itself was waiting for something. I tried to brush it off. I was just tired, exhausted, really. That night, as I lay in my tent, the whispers returned, louder this time, clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something real. The whispers grew, surrounding me, coming from every direction. They weren't in English, not even Spanish. It was an ancient language, guttural and rhythmic, like a chant I couldn't understand. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart racing. I reached for my flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam sputtered and died. My hands fumbled in the darkness, searching for my backup lantern. When I found it, I clicked it on, flooding the tent with light, but the whispers didn't stop. They only seemed to get closer. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just anxiety. Something was out there. I stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The fire I had built earlier had long since died down to embers. I looked around, scanning the landscape with my lantern. That's when I saw it. The small stone cairns, dozens of them, scattered around the edges of my campsite like tiny tombstones. They hadn't been there when I set up camp. I was sure of it. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here, or something. My mind raced. Could it have been other hikers? A prank, maybe? But the trail had been empty when I arrived, and this was an isolated spot. No one would have come this far just to mess with me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. My hands were shaking as I backed toward my tent, the beam of my lantern swinging wildly across the ground. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, just at the edge of the light, darting between the rocks. It was too fast to be human. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the lantern around, trying to catch another glimpse. But there was nothing, just the empty desert. I bolted back into my tent, zipping it shut behind me, as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. I sat there, gripping the lantern, listening to the whispers fade into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made my heart jump. Every gust of wind felt like something moving just outside. By morning, the whispers were gone, but the unease lingered. I packed up camp, deciding to cut my trip short. I'd head back to the trailhead, call it a failure, and go home. There was no shame in that. But as I started hiking back, something was off. The trail didn't look right. The landmarks, the rock formations, they weren't where they should have been. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself, but nothing matched. It was like the land itself had shifted overnight. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank, dead. My phone, too, had lost all power. Panic set in. I was lost, completely, utterly lost, in the middle of the desert. I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe. I could find my way back. I'd just retrace my steps. But no matter how far I walked, the landscape seemed to warp around me, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. My footprints, which should have been visible in the sand, were gone, erased, as if I'd never walked that way at all. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on me, but the cold from the night before hadn't left. It clung to me, seeping into my bones. And then I saw it again, the shadow. It was further away this time, just a dark figure standing on the ridge watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin. I couldn't make out any features, just its silhouette against the sky. It didn't move, it didn't come closer. It just stood there, watching. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get away from it. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I scrambled over the rocks, my pack bouncing against my back. But no matter how far I ran, the figure was always there, always just at the edge of my vision, standing still, waiting. My mind raced with the legends I'd read before the trip, stories of Lalahor, the evil hour, a spirit that lured travelers to their doom. It was said to appear just before tragedy struck, a warning of death. I hadn't believed in those stories. Not really. But now, with the shadow stalking me, I wasn't so sure. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert. I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind frayed. I couldn't keep running. I had to face it. I stopped, turning to look at the ridge behind me. The shadow was closer now, standing still, its dark form blending with the rocks. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I'm not afraid," I said aloud, though my voice wavered. "I'm not afraid of you." The shadow didn't move, but I felt its presence, heavy and oppressive, weighing down on me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stand my ground. Slowly, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the landscape like smoke. The whispers, too, faded into the wind, growing quieter until they were gone. I stood there for a long time, the desert silent once more. The sky darkened above me. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. The next morning, I found the trail. The landscape had returned to normal, the landmarks in the right places, as if nothing had changed. I made my way back to the trailhead, my legs weak, my mind still spinning from the encounter. I left Big Ben that day, never to return. Some people might say it was just my imagination, that the isolation and the anxiety had gotten to me. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The desert is a place of mystery, a place where the veil between worlds is thin, and sometimes something crosses over. I parked my RV deep in the Black Hills, farther than I'd ever dared to go before. The last sign of civilization had been a gas station over an hour back, and now it was just me, the trees, and the silence. And that was exactly what I wanted: solitude. After the divorce, I craved it like a drug. I needed this trip to remind myself of who I used to be, before the arguments, before the failures, before the loneliness settled in like a slow-burning rod. Out here, surrounded by miles of forest, I'd find peace. At least that's what I told myself as I killed the engine, the sudden quiet swallowing me whole. I climbed out of the RV and stretched, breathing in the sharp, cold air. The Black Hills were breathtaking, tall, ancient pines rising like sentinels against the darkening sky. The wind was still, not even a rustle of leaves, just silence. I walked around the clearing, feeling the weight of the world lift ever so slightly with each step. This was why I loved the wilderness, the isolation, the escape. But there was something off this time, a heaviness in the air. I'd been here before, years ago, but it had never felt like this. I shook off the feeling. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had been a rough few months, and I wasn't thinking straight. A couple of nights out here would fix that. I busied myself with setting up camp, though I didn't have much to do. The RV had everything I needed. I lit a fire outside anyway, for old time's sake, and poured myself a drink. I sat on the fold-out chair and stared into the flames, letting the warmth pull me in. Then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like tapping. I looked around, but there was nothing. Probably just the forest settling. I turned back to the fire, trying to relax, but the noise came again, rhythmic, deliberate this time. I couldn't shake it off. Animals, I muttered to myself, standing up and shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense undergrowth. I scanned the edge of the forest, expecting to see a raccoon or a deer, but there was nothing. Just the trees, standing tall, unmoving. I took a deep breath and laughed. I was being paranoid. The first night alone always did this to me, made me jump at shadows. I headed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. That night I slept fitfully. Dreams of my ex-wife drifted through my mind, her face twisted in anger, her voice echoing in that same sharp, accusing tone I knew too well. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. By morning, the feeling of unease still clung to me like a damp fog. I tried to ignore it, pushing myself to enjoy the day. I spent the morning hiking, trying to lose myself in the familiar sights of the Black Hills, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt off, too quiet, too still. I returned to the RV just after midday, planning to settle in and enjoy a lazy afternoon. That's when the real problems began. The generator sputtered and died as I tried to start it up. I cursed, fiddling with the switch, but nothing happened. No power, no lights, and no heat. I wasn't worried yet. I couldn't figure it out. I always did, but the frustration simmered beneath the surface. I was already on edge, and the last thing I needed was for the RV to start malfunctioning. I grabbed my toolkit and went outside, working on the generator for what felt like hours. As I crouched next to the RV, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, wrench in hand, listening. There it was again. Soft, slow steps, like someone was circling me. I whipped around, but the forest was empty. Just the same dense pines, I standing silent, watching. "Get it together, Jack," I muttered, turning back to the generator. By dusk, I was back inside. The generator was still dead, and the RV was cold, but I told myself it was fine. I'd built a fire outside, so I didn't need heat in here. I sat by the fire again, staring out into the forest, hoping the flames would chase away the anxiety that had been building all day. That's when I saw them. Shadows, just at the edge of the firelight. They were tall, thin, humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too elongated, too stiff. They stood between the trees, unmoving, watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but they didn't disappear. They were still there, standing in the shadows just beyond the fire. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. The figures remained still, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I stood up slowly, grabbing the flashlight and shining it toward them, but the beam seemed to bounce off the darkness, unable to penetrate the trees. When I lowered the light, they were gone. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I paced the small space, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone followed me out here? Were they messing with me? I grabbed my phone, only to find the battery drained, dead. The same with my watch. I was completely cut off. I tried to calm myself down, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. I felt like I was being watched, even inside the RV. I peeked out the window, expecting to see those figures again, but the clearing was empty. The fire outside was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the ground. I crawled into bed, wrapping myself in blankets to ward off the chill that had settled in. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was jumping at shadows because of the divorce, because of the loneliness. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I barely slept that night, and when I did, my dreams were filled with strange voices, whispers that sounded like my ex-wife, but hollow, distorted. She called to me from the darkness, telling me to come outside, to follow her into the trees. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It was morning, but the RV was still freezing. I could see my breath fogging in the air. I had to leave. Something was wrong here, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I threw my things together, ready to get the hell out of the Black Hills, but when I tried the engine, the RV wouldn't start. No matter how many times I turned the key, it sputtered and died. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, panic rising in my chest. I grabbed my bag and rushed outside, but as soon as I stepped into the clearing, I froze. They were back. The figures, tall, hollow-eyed shadows, stood at the tree line, surrounding the clearing. Dozens of them now, all watching me, waiting. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The fire had burned out during the night, and the clearing was shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. I had to get out of here. The figures didn't move as I grabbed my camping knife and marched toward the nearest tree, determined to hack my way out of this nightmare. I had seen strange carvings on some of the trees, symbols, jagged and twisted. Maybe they had something to do with this, something to do with the figures. With trembling hands, I drove the blade into the bark, carving through the strange lines. As soon as I broke the symbol, the air shifted. The shadows flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard a low echo and wail. I didn't stop. I hacked at the trees, cutting through every symbol I could find. The voices in my head grew louder with each slash. My ex-wife's voice, distorted and hollow, begged me to stop, telling me to come into the forest, to let go. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. Finally, when I had cut through the last symbol, the air went still. The figures at the tree line melted away, dissolving into the fog. I stumbled back to the RV, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The engine roared to life on the first try. I sped out of the clearing, not daring to look back. The Black Hills vanished behind me, swallowed by the fog. But even now, as I write this, I can still feel them watching, waiting. The hollow ones never really let you go. I should have known something was wrong the second I stepped out of the RV. The forest around me felt too still, the kind of stillness that makes you question whether the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But I brushed it off. I was in the middle of the Sawtooth National Forest, miles from any other campers or hikers. This was exactly what I wanted, complete isolation. This place was going to make for the perfect series on my channel, Unmarked Trails. I'd call it a deep dive into forgotten paths, places people were too afraid to explore. And this one, it had all the elements of a viral video. No one knew much about the unmarked trail I was hunting, only vague rumors of hikers disappearing and whispered stories of something called the Collector. Something about that name intrigued me. I wasn't one to believe in folklore or ghost stories, but my audience loved them, and that's what mattered. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I hiked, filmed B-roll footage, and narrated into my camera about the history of the area. The trail I was following wasn't exactly easy to find. I had to rely on a few tips from locals, a vague map sketched by a guide at a general store, and a lot of guesswork. But I found it, an overgrown path cutting into the forest, almost hidden by the surrounding brush. Perfect. This is it, I said into the camera, feeling the excitement bubble up. The Forgotten Trail. I spent that afternoon hiking along it, deeper into the wilderness than I'd planned. Time got away from me. but the sun was still up, casting golden light through the canopy. I knew I had to head back to camp soon, but the trail kept pulling me further. I wanted more footage, more content for the channel. By the time I returned to my RV, dusk was settling in. I set my gear down, sat by the fire I'd built earlier, and reviewed the footage. That's when I noticed it. In the background of one of my shots, there was something. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was faint, barely visible, but definitely there. A tall, shadowy outline, watching me. I rewound the clip and zoomed in, but when I played it back again, the figure was gone. Just trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had been alone all day, hadn't I? It's nothing, I muttered to myself, shaking off the creeping unease. Probably a glitch in the camera, some kind of light distortion. I'd seen that before. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my eyes kept drifting back to the tree line, scanning for movement. Nothing. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me sit up in bed, ears straining, heart pounding. But the forest was quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves. Still, that feeling, the gnawing sensation of being watched, clung to me, even as the fire burned down to embers outside. The next morning, I pushed my nerves aside and geared up again. Today was the day I was going to push deeper into the trail. I was determined to find something, anything, that could give my channel the edge I was looking for. I packed my camera, drone, and enough supplies to last until nightfall. As I set off, something felt different. The forest had taken on an oppressive quality. The air was heavier, the light dimmer. The trail seemed to have changed too. The trees were growing closer together, the undergrowth thicker. Landmarks I thought I'd passed before were suddenly missing. Or maybe I'd misremembered them. Either way, I felt more disoriented than I'd like to admit. But I pressed on. Several hours into the hike, my camera started malfunctioning. The battery, fully charged that morning, drained rapidly. The drone refused to take off. When I checked the footage I'd shot, static filled the screen, blurring everything. My frustration grew, but I wasn't about to quit. Not yet. That's when I saw it again. Ahead on the trail, the figure. It stood between two trees, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough to feel its presence. Tall, impossibly tall, and still. My breath hitched as I fumbled for the camera, but by the time I raised it, the figure had vanished again. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse racing. What the hell was that? I wasn't imagining things. There had been someone or something out there, but there was no sign of anyone now. No footprints, no rustling leaves, just silence. I should have turned back then. I should have packed up and left. But something deeper than curiosity kept me going. It was pride, maybe ego, the need to prove to myself that I wasn't just a YouTuber chasing shadows. I was a professional. I knew these woods. I pressed on, my mind racing with thoughts of how this footage, real or not, could be my breakthrough. I could see the thumbnails, the titles, the Cursed Collector Trail, captured on film. It would go viral, guaranteed. But as the hours dragged on, the trail seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone anymore. The sun, which should have been high in the sky, seemed to hang low, casting long shadows earlier than it should have. And then I heard the whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible over the crunch of my boots on the dirt, but the deeper I went, the clearer they became. Voices, indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. I stopped, straining to listen. My heart thudded in my chest. Ryan. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but hearing my name sent a cold shiver down my spine. I spun around, scanning the forest, but there was no one, just trees. And then there it was again. The figure, closer this time. It stood in the shadows, tall and unmoving, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I took a step back, my breath quickening. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. Ryan. The voice was clearer now, coming from the figure. My legs felt heavy, frozen in place as I stared, unable to look away. It didn't move, didn't approach. It just stood there, watching. I fumbled for my camera, hands shaking, but when I hit record, the screen flickered and went black. The battery was dead again. My phone too, completely drained, though it had been fully charged that morning. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted down the trail, my feet pounding the dirt. But no matter how far I ran, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The landscape twisted around me, trails splitting off in directions I hadn't seen before, paths looping back on themselves. I was trapped. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, my head spinning. The whispers hadn't stopped. They circled around me now, growing louder, more insistent. Come deeper. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that clouded my mind. I wasn't going to let this happen. I'd survived worse. I just needed to think, to get my bearings. But then I saw it. The RV. I stumbled forward, relief flooding through me as I reached the clearing. But something was wrong. The RV looked different, older, like it had been sitting there for years, weathered and decaying. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had only been gone a day, 2 at most. But the way the RV sagged, its windows cracked, and the rust that ate away at the metal, it felt like I'd been gone for much longer. Ryan. The voice was right behind me. I turned, and there it was, the collector. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its shadows stretching toward me, its eyes glowing brighter now, like embers in the dark. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Ryan, come with me. The collector's voice was a low whisper, soft and inviting, pulling at me, urging me to follow. It took a step forward, and I could feel its presence, heavy and cold, as though the very air around me had thickened. No, I choked out, my voice barely audible. The collector's eyes burned into me, its shadow growing longer, reaching out. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free of the paralysis that gripped me. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted into the trees, away from the RV, away from the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and shifting as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears, growing louder and louder until they became a roar. But I kept running, pushing through the exhaustion, the fear, the disorientation. I didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. And when I finally did, I realized I had made it out. The forest was still behind me, the whispers gone, the collector nowhere in sight. I was alive, but I didn't feel relief, only emptiness. I left the Sawtooth National Forest that day, my RV abandoned where it had been claimed by the forest. I never posted the footage. There was nothing to show anyway, just static, shadows, and whispers. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the collector calling my name, waiting. I wasn't sure why I'd come back. Maybe it was the need for closure, a way to put everything behind me. It had been over a year since my wife Sarah passed away, and ever since I'd been drifting through life, avoiding people and dodging their well-meaning questions. When I was a park ranger, the forest had always been my sanctuary, and I thought maybe, just maybe, a trip back to the Cherokee National Forest would help clear my head. But as I parked my RV in a secluded spot deep in the forest, far away from the designated campsites, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was a mistake. The sun was setting, casting long shadows between the trees, and I watched the colors fade into darkness as I set up camp. The last time I'd been here was with Sarah, years ago, when life still made sense. Now it was just me, alone with my thoughts. I wanted the isolation. I needed the silence, or at least that's what I told myself. I sat by the fire, the crackle of the flames the only sound in the stillness of the forest. The night pressed in around me, thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I stared into the fire, my mind drifting back to Sarah. I could almost hear her laugh, see her smile through the flickering flames. That's why I was here, to say goodbye, to finally let her go. I thought this place, our place, would help me find some peace. I was wrong. It started with a phone call. I'd turned my phone off the moment I arrived, didn't want any distractions, didn't need anyone bothering me. But as I sat there, staring into the flames, I heard it. The familiar sound of my phone ringing. I frowned, confused. I hadn't turned it back on. Slowly, I stood up and walked over to where I'd left it on the small table inside the RV. The screen was glowing, showing an unknown number. How was that possible? I had no signal out here, not this far from the nearest cell tower. Curiosity got the better of me. I answered the call. Hello? My voice was rougher than I expected, a little shaky at first. There was nothing but static, a low hum that buzzed in my ear. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Dan. I froze. My blood turned to ice. It was Sarah's voice. Dan, it's me. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing to find some logical explanation. It had to be a prank, some sick joke. But the voice, it was hers. The way she said my name, that soft, familiar tone. Sarah, I whispered, barely able to get the word out. The static surged louder now, drowning out the voice. I called out again, but the line went dead. I stood there in the RV, staring at the phone in my hand, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What the hell just happened? I checked the call log. Nothing. No record of the call. It was like it had never happened. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind. Grief does strange things to people. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I just wanted to hear her voice again so badly that my mind had created it. But as I sat back down by the fire, the unease gnawed at me. Something felt wrong. The night wore on, and the fire died down to embers. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. The quiet felt oppressive now, too heavy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to forget the sound of her voice. Then the phone rang again. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my ears. The screen glowed in the dark, the same unknown number flashing across it. I hesitated this time, but eventually answered. Dan. The voice was clearer now, more distinct. It was Sarah, no doubt about it. Come to me. The line crackled, and for a moment, I swore I heard something else. A faint knocking sound, like someone tapping on the walls of the RV. I jumped out of bed and hurried to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing, just the dense forest, silent and still. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to calm myself down. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think rationally. There was no way Sarah could be calling me. She was gone. I knew that. I'd buried her. But the voice, it was so real. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the RV had me on edge. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I hiked some familiar trails, took in the beauty of the forest, and reminded myself why I loved this place. But the feeling of unease never left me. It lingered like a shadow, always just out of sight. That evening, as I sat by the fire again, my phone rang. I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach. The same unknown number, the same impossible call. I let it ring, watching the screen until it finally stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was over. But then the RV shook. It was subtle at first, just a faint tremor like something had bumped into it. I stood up, glancing around the campsite. No wind, no animals, nothing that could have caused it. Then I heard the knocking again, soft, deliberate, like someone tapping on the side of the RV. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but there was no one there, just the empty forest, silent as ever. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. It had to be an animal, a deer maybe. But as I turned back to the RV, I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but it looked like a person. My heart skipped a beat. Hello? I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, squinting into the darkness. The figure stepped back, disappearing into the trees. I ran after it, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Wait! But when I reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing. No tracks. No signs that anyone had been there at all. Just me and the towering trees, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal hands. I turned back, my head spinning. This couldn't be real. It had to be the grief, the isolation messing with me. Maybe I'd finally lost it. As I walked back to the RV, my phone rang again. I didn't want to answer it, but I couldn't stop myself. I picked it up, my hand trembling. Dan, I'm here. Come to me. The voice was so clear now, so real. It sounded like Sarah was right there with me, just out of reach. I miss you, she whispered. Come find me. My chest tightened. Tears stung my eyes. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe she was still out there, waiting for me. But I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. I slammed the phone down and ran into the RV, locking the door behind me. The knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent. Something wanted me to open that door. Something wanted me to follow. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the knocks, the whispers, my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The following day, I packed up camp. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I needed to leave now. But the forest had other plans. As I drove through the winding forest roads, trying to make my way back to the main road, I realized something terrifying. I was lost. No matter which turn I took, I ended up back in the same place. The same trees, the same path. The forest was keeping me here. My phone rang again. I ignored it, but the knock came back, echoing through the RV, louder and louder, until I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, jumping out of the RV, screaming into the trees. "Leave me alone!" The forest answered with silence, and then the whispers returned. Sarah's voice rising on the wind, calling to me, luring me deeper into the trees. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed the only thing I had left, my lighter. I built a fire bigger than any I'd made before, the flames roaring into the sky. The knocks stopped. The whispers faded. The forest was quiet again. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't over. I eventually found my way out, back to civilization, but I left the RV behind. I couldn't bring myself to take it with me. I knew what was waiting in those woods. I never went back to the Cherokee National Forest, and every night when the phone rings, I don't answer because I know it's not her. People say the Appalachian forests are haunted. I'd heard the rumors, whispers of restless spirits and strange disappearances, but I'd never given them much thought. After years of debunking ghost stories as a journalist, I became the kind of person who trusted facts, not folklore. Still, I couldn't resist the pull of Pisgah National Forest. It was remote, beautiful, and full of forgotten places that no one cared to visit anymore. Perfect for the series I'd been working on for my blog, Ghost Towns of the Forgotten South. This was my passion now, traveling, exploring the lost corners of America and turning those empty spaces into stories. This time, I was after an old settlement deep in the forest, one that most people in town wouldn't even talk about. There were no records of why it had been abandoned, just strange rumors of sickness and disappearances. But those stories were always embellished over time. People loved their spooky tales, and it was my job to sift the truth from the legend. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near the trailhead, not far from the ghost town, or what remained of it. I planned to spend a couple of nights out here, explore, take some pictures, and maybe talk to a few locals who might know more about its history. The air was crisp and cool as I stepped outside. The towering trees cast long shadows, making it feel later than it was. As I set up camp, I noticed how unnaturally quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I brushed it off. Deep forests always had a strange stillness about them. I'd been in enough of them to know that the real danger was tripping over a root, not some ghostly figure hiding behind the trees. That first night, I woke to a distant sound, like laughter. It was faint, barely a whisper on the wind. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. Could there be other campers out here? I doubted it. This part of the forest wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot. My phone was dead, but I'd recorded some video earlier in the day. I grabbed my camera and replayed the footage. There it was, faint, like a breeze blowing through, but unmistakable, children's laughter. I pushed it out of my mind and went back to sleep. I had a lot of ground to cover tomorrow, and the last thing I needed was to let my imagination run wild. The next day, I set out to find the old settlement. It was slow going. Thick overgrowth and fading trails made navigation difficult. The map I had was basic, nothing more than a dotted line leading me deeper into the woods. The farther I went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was closing in around me. But I kept going, determined to find this place. After about an hour, I noticed carvings, symbols, strange and jagged, etched into the bark of the trees. They weren't any kind of writing I recognized, but they gave me an uneasy feeling. Maybe it was some old superstition, a way to ward off bad spirits. I took a few photos and kept moving. It was another hour before I finally found it. The ghost town was just as eerie as I'd imagined. Small, dilapidated cabins stood in clusters, some half collapsed under the weight of time and nature. Weeds and vines crept over everything, reclaiming the land. I walked through the empty streets, my camera clicking as I captured the desolation, the eerie stillness. That's when I saw the cemetery, small, tucked away behind what must have been the church, though the building itself was nothing more than a few rotting beams. The graves were old, the names barely legible, but the dates caught my eye. Some of them were from decades ago, but others were from the future. My first instinct was that it had to be a mistake, some kind of misprint or vandalism, but the stones looked too old, too weathered to be recent. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped back from the graves. It didn't make sense, and I didn't like the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I realized then that I hadn't heard anything. Not birds, not insects. Nothing since I'd arrived. I packed up my camera and headed back toward my RV. I'd gotten what I came for and figured I'd do some research on the strange gravestones when I got back to town. But something was wrong. The trail didn't look right. I was sure I'd come from this direction, but now the trees seemed different. The symbols I'd passed earlier weren't there anymore, and the forest seemed denser, more oppressive. My pulse quickened. I was lost. That was impossible. I never got lost, not with GPS and maps, not with all the preparation I'd done. I kept walking, trying to retrace my steps, but the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. Every turn led me to unfamiliar territory, and soon the forest looked completely foreign. My sense of time slipped away, and the sky started to darken, even though it felt like midday. Then I saw it, just ahead, through the trees. A figure stood on the trail, tall and motionless, watching me. I stopped cold, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding smaller than I'd intended. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, squinting through the gloom, but as I did, it vanished, just gone. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. My hands shook as I adjusted my pack. This was wrong. Everything was wrong. The sun had nearly set by the time I found my RV. It was parked where I left it, but somehow the journey back had taken hours longer than it should have. My legs were aching, my mind spinning with confusion. I climbed inside, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the bed. That's when the laughter started again. Louder this time, right outside the RV. I shot up, my heart pounding. I could hear them. Children laughing and running around, their voices bouncing off the trees. I grabbed the camera, pointing it toward the window. But the moment I did, the laughter stopped. The forest was silent again, suffocating in its stillness. I played back the footage on the camera, hoping to catch something, anything that would explain what was happening. But instead, I heard something else. A voice, clear as day, whispering my name. "Alex," I froze. The camera dropped from my hands and hit the floor with a thud, the sound echoing in the empty RV. Something was out there, and it knew my name. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed, every muscle tense, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. I thought about leaving, driving out of the forest and abandoning the project altogether. But the RV wouldn't start. I tried the engine a dozen times, but it was dead. Dead as if the battery had drained overnight. My phone was useless, still dead from the day before. I was completely cut off. The next morning, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever was out there watching me. I remembered the symbols on the trees, the strange carvings I'd seen on my hike. They had to mean something. Maybe they were the key to getting out of here. I grabbed my camping knife and headed back into the woods. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of dread. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep walking. I found the first symbol carved into the bark of a tree just off the trail. With a deep breath, I drove the blade into the wood, carving through the lines. As soon as the symbol was broken, the air shifted. The forest seemed to shudder, and for a moment I thought I heard a scream, a distant echo and wail carried on the wind. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but I kept going. I found the next tree and did the same, cutting through the strange lines with my knife. The voices grew louder, the laughter, the whispers, all swirling around me like a storm. I could see the figures now, darting between the trees, shadowy, faceless figures watching, waiting. They wanted me to stop. They didn't want me to leave. But I wasn't going to be trapped here, not like them. I reached the final tree, my hands trembling as I raised the knife. The voices were deafening now, the figures closing in, but I didn't stop. With one last slash, I broke the symbol, and just like that, the voices stopped. The forest went still. The shadows vanished, and the oppressive weight that had hung over me lifted. I stumbled back toward my RV, half expecting the figures to reappear, but the woods were empty. When I got back, the engine started on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove out of the forest, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles wide. I wasn't going to write about this place. I wasn't going to tell anyone what happened here. Some things are better left forgotten. I've always believed that everything has an explanation. Ghost stories, strange occurrences, they're all just misinterpretations of reality. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV deep into the desert, chasing the Marfa lights, one of those unexplained phenomena that people love to whisper about. I was determined to demystify them, capture them on camera, and show the world that there was nothing supernatural about it. The desert stretched out before me, flat and endless, the sky a deep, cloudless blue. I'd parked my RV on the outskirts of Marfa, Texas, far enough from the town to avoid any distractions. The lights were supposed to appear at night, floating out there in the desert like glowing orbs. People called them spirits or even UFOs, but I knew better. I was here to photograph them, document them, and move on. That first night was quiet, too quiet. I set up my camera gear just outside the RV, tripods locked in place, lenses ready for long exposure shots. The desert was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you've been buried under a blanket. No wind, no animals, not even the hum of distant cars. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I'd been alone in the wild before. This was nothing new. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up and call it a night, the lights appeared. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable, small glowing orbs that hovered just above the horizon. I leaned forward in my chair, eyes fixed on them. They weren't anything special, just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, I thought. But then, they moved slowly, almost deliberately. They floated closer, their soft glow reflecting off the desert sand. I snapped photo after photo, my fingers flying over the camera buttons. This was exactly what I'd come for, clear, undeniable evidence. No one could call this supernatural nonsense once I had the data. But the lights were behaving differently than I expected. They weren't just floating randomly, they were almost watching me. I stood up, staring at the lights as they hovered, flickering softly, maybe 50 yards away. Then suddenly, they darted closer. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped back instinctively. The lights pulsed, brightening for a moment before retreating, as if they were playing with me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Just lights, just gases or atmospheric anomalies, nothing to be afraid of. But the way they moved, it was like they were alive. I shook my head, frustrated. "Focus, Greg. It's all explainable," I muttered to myself. I turned back to my camera gear, checking the shots I'd taken. That's when the first problem started. The images were completely corrupted. Every shot I'd taken of the lights was ruined. Nothing but distorted lines and static, like an old TV losing signal. I flipped through the photos in disbelief. The lights had been right there, clear as day, but my camera had failed to capture a single usable image. My stomach churned. That wasn't right. I'd tested all the equipment before I left. I'd checked the camera, adjusted the settings, but the battery was draining fast. Too fast. The indicator flashed red, and within seconds, the camera died in my hands. Damn it! I hissed, grabbing my backup battery, but it was no use. Everything, camera, spare batteries, even my phone, was losing power faster than it should. It was like something was draining the life out of my equipment. Frustrated, I packed up my gear and headed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried not to think about the lights still hovering outside, flickering just beyond the window. It had to be a glitch, I told myself. I'd deal with it in the morning. But I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in around me. Every so often, I'd glance at the window, expecting to see the lights hovering there. I didn't want to admit it, but something about them unnerved me. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent hours checking my gear, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, but everything looked fine. The equipment was fully functional again, as if nothing had happened. It was strange, but I wasn't about to let one weird night stop me. I'd try again tonight, capture the lights properly this time. As evening fell, I set up my gear again, determined to make up for last night. The desert was still, the sky a dull orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. I watched, waiting for the lights to appear, and they did. But this time, they were closer. They floated just above the sand, pulsing softly, glowing brighter than before. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them move. Their rhythm was almost hypnotic. But it wasn't just their movement that startled me. It was the fact that they seemed to be getting nearer. I reached for my camera, ready to capture them again, but the battery was dead. Again. I checked my phone. Dead. Panic flickered at the edge of my mind. This wasn't possible. The lights were now just 30 feet away, their glow casting long shadows on the ground. They pulsed brighter, flickering in strange, almost deliberate patterns. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like they were trying to communicate. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the wind brushing past my ear. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. Greg. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one, just the empty desert. The whisper came again, closer this time. Greg. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't explainable. The lights were hovering just a few feet away now, and the whispers, they were inside my head. I scrambled into the RV, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. The lights were outside the window, pulsing, flickering. The whispering continued, filling the small space with eerie, disembodied voices. I tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power, no escape. The lights pressed closer, their glow filling the RV, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt them, those whispers, crawling into my mind, telling me to come outside, to follow them into the desert. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wasn't going to let this beat me. I wasn't going to give in to fear. But then, the lights began to move. They circled the RV faster and faster, like they were closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Follow the lights. I felt a tug, a pull in my chest, as if the lights were calling me, drawing me out of the RV. I fought against it, but it was getting harder to resist. The lights flickered faster, the whispers filling my head until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed my jacket and kicked the door open, running into the desert. The lights followed, darting around me, leading me deeper into the night. I stumbled through the sand, my heart pounding. The whispers guided me further from the RV, but something inside me snapped. I stopped running, gasping for air, and turned to face the lights. I wasn't going to follow them. I wasn't going to disappear like so many before me. No, I shouted, my voice trembling. I won't go. The lights pulsed, flickering faster. The whispers screamed in my head, but I stood my ground, forcing myself to ignore them. Slowly, the lights began to fade. The whispers grew softer until they were nothing more than faint echoes in the wind. I stumbled back to the RV, exhausted, my mind spinning. The lights were gone, retreating into the desert, but I knew they'd be back. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. By morning, I packed up and left Marfa. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the desert, far from the lights. I never told anyone what happened. No one would believe me anyway. but I'll never forget those lights. The way they moved, the way they whispered my name. I came here to prove they were just a natural phenomenon, just an unexplained mystery of the desert. But now I know better. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some lights should never be followed. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions. But there I was, driving deeper into Fort Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore, vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer, damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a gray blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow, I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map, it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers, nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it. That creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. Hello? My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices, coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time, there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer, but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I had come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out. But it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't getting out. My name is Timothy Perez, and in 2015, I ventured to Isle Royale in Michigan to escape the bustle of city life. I'd always been the kind of guy who preferred the whisper of the trees over the honking of horns, and this remote island seemed like the perfect getaway. I arrived on a chilly morning, the kind where your breath fogs up like a bad magic trick. The ferry ride over Lake Superior was uneventful, save for an older gentleman who warned me about the island's unpredictable weather. "If you don't like it," he chuckled, "just wait 6 minutes." I laughed it off, thinking I'd heard that joke in every town I'd ever visited. Isle Royale was everything I hoped it would be. Dense forests, crystal clear lakes, and trails that seemed to stretch on forever. I set up camp near Rock Harbor, not far from where the ferry had dropped me off. The plan was simple: hike, take photos, and maybe find some inspiration for the novel I'd been pretending to write for years. You know, the one where the hero saves the world and gets the girl, all while maintaining perfect hair. On my second day, I met a group of hikers: Tom, Lisa, and their teenage son Max. They were from Chicago and had that Midwestern friendliness that makes you feel like you've known them for years. We exchanged pleasantries, and they invited me to join them for dinner at their campsite. Never one to turn down free food, especially when my options were dwindling packets of instant noodles, I gladly accepted. As we sat around the campfire that evening, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories, Tom shared tales about the island's wildlife. "They say the wolves here are some of the most elusive creatures you'll never see," he said, poking the fire with a stick. "Maybe they're just introverted," I quipped. "Can't blame them for wanting some peace and quiet." Max rolled his eyes. "Dad thinks every rustle in the bushes is a wolf waiting to pounce." "Better safe than sorry," Lisa interjected, smiling warmly. The night sky was a canvas of stars, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Little did I know that would be the last time things felt normal. The next morning, we decided to hike together to Mount Ojibwe, one of the island's higher points, promising breathtaking views. As we trekked through the forest, conversations flowed easily. Max complained about not having cell service. Tom told another one of his infamous dad jokes: "Why don't oysters donate to charity?" "Because they're shellfish." And Lisa kept us all in line with her motherly charm. About halfway up, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station. It looked like it hadn't seen maintenance since flip phones were cutting-edge technology. Curious, we decided to take a look inside. The door creaked ominously. Classic horror movie stuff, I know. The interior was sparse: a broken chair, a desk with outdated maps, and a musty smell that could have been bottled and sold as ode to neglect. Max found a faded journal tucked in a drawer. Flipping through it, his face paled. "Listen to this," he said. "June 5th, 1998, sightings of an unknown animal have increased. Rangers advised to travel in pairs. 2 hikers reported missing." "Probably just old campfire stories," I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "Or maybe the previous ranger had an overactive imagination." Tom shrugged. "Still, maybe we should stick together. Safety in numbers, right?" We continued our hike, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. Even the birds had ceased their chatter. I joked that they must be on a union-mandated break, but no one laughed. Reaching the summit, the view was as spectacular as promised. Lake Superior stretched out endlessly, its waters glistening under the midday sun. We ate lunch in relative silence, the earlier unease still lingering. On our way back, we noticed something odd. The forest floor, which had been carpeted with leaves and twigs, now showed signs of disturbance. Deep gashes marred the trees, and patches of ground looked as though they'd been clawed by something large. "Probably a bear," Tom speculated, though his voice lacked conviction. "Do bears even live on this island?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide. "Mostly wolves and moose," I replied, "but I've never heard of moose doing this." Max snapped a few pictures. "Maybe we'll go viral," he said, attempting a grin. "Teen documents mysterious forest creature. Click here to find out what happens next." "Let's keep moving," Tom suggested, picking up the pace. As we neared the split where we'd go our separate ways, me back to Rock Harbor, them to their campsite, Tom placed a hand on my shoulder. "You sure you don't want to join us for dinner again?" I smiled. "Thanks, but I think I'll turn in early tonight. Besides, I can't mooch off you guys forever." Lisa handed me a walkie-talkie. "Just in case. Channel 6. We'd feel better knowing we can reach you." I accepted it gratefully. "Thanks. I'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen?" We parted ways, and I headed back to my tent. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that danced eerily among the trees. I told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, I came here to escape stress, not invent new reasons for it. Settling into my tent, I decided to review the photos I had taken. Scrolling through the images, one caught my eye. It was from the summit, a panoramic shot. But there, among the trees, was a dark shape that hadn't been there before. Zooming in didn't help. It only made the image grainier. "Probably just a trick of the light," I muttered. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. Nothing out of the ordinary. I crawled into my sleeping bag, grateful for its warmth. Sometime later, I awoke to a faint crackling sound. At first I thought it was rain, but the sky had been clear. Then I smelled it. Smoke. Unzipping my tent, I peeked outside to see a small fire burning near the tree line. That's not supposed to be there, I thought. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously approached. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a random blaze. It was a campfire. Around it lay scattered belongings: a backpack, a hat, a hiking boot. No signs of people, though. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone there?" Silence. I noticed the backpack had a name tag: Kevin Moore. Rifling through it seemed invasive, but I was concerned someone might be hurt. Inside, I found the usual: water bottle, trail mix, a map, but also a journal. Flipping it open, the last entry read, "Something is following me. I can hear it at night. If anyone finds this." A chill ran down my spine. Not the figurative kind people write about, but a genuine, icy dread. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. I decided to head back to my tent when the radio crackled. Just then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, echoing through the forest. It was human, filled with terror, and abruptly cut off. I sprinted back to my campsite, hands shaking as I fumbled with the walkie-talkie. "Tom, Lisa, do you copy? Tom, Max, anyone?" Finally, a crackling response. "Timothy, what's going on?" I heard a scream near my camp. Found someone's gear, but no person. Something's not right. "Stay put. We're on our way," Tom replied. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I kept the flashlight beam moving, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, in the periphery of the light, I saw it. A massive silhouette lurking between the trees. It moved with a fluidity that was unnerving for something its size. I pointed the flashlight directly at it. The creature resembled a wolf, but stood upright like a human. Its fur was a mottled mix of grays and blacks. Its snout was elongated, teeth glinting as it snarled, eyes fixed on me. It let out a sound that was somewhere between a howl and a roar. My mind raced. This can't be real, I thought. Did someone spike my trail mix? Fight or flight kicked in, and flight won by a landslide. I bolted in the direction I hoped was toward Tom and Lisa. Behind me, I heard the creature crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground despite my adrenaline-fueled sprint. Ahead, I saw the beam of another flashlight. "Timothy!" Perez's voice shouted. "Run!" I yelled. "Go back!" But it was too late. The creature lunged between us, grabbing Max with clawed hands. He screamed as it dragged him into the darkness. "Max!" Lisa shrieked, dropping to her knees. Tom grabbed her arm. "We have to move!" I stood there, paralyzed by shock. Tom shook me. "Timothy, we need to get to safety now!" We stumbled through the forest, the creature's guttural sounds echoing behind us. Reaching a rocky outcrop, we wedged ourselves into a narrow crevice. The creature couldn't fit but clawed at the entrance, its razor-like nails scraping against the stone. Lisa was sobbing uncontrollably. Tom held her, his face a mask of despair. "We have to do something," I whispered. "And what do you suggest?" Tom snapped. "Offered a s'more?" Despite the dire situation, a hysterical laugh bubbled up. "I always knew camping was a bad idea," I muttered. "Next time, I'm sticking to Netflix and chill." "Assuming there is a next time," Tom retorted. Hours seemed to pass as we huddled together. The creature eventually retreated, but we could hear it pacing nearby, waiting. "We can't stay here forever," Lisa whispered. "At dawn, we'll make a run for the ranger station," Tom decided. "Assuming that place is still standing," I added. Morning light filtered in, and the forest took on an almost serene appearance, betraying the horrors of the night. We cautiously emerged, every snap of a twig making us jump. The trek to the ranger station was tense but uneventful. When we arrived, the place looked as abandoned as before, but it was our only hope. Inside, we found an old radio. Tom fiddled with it. Come on, he urged. "Static." Then a voice. "This is Ranger Dispatch. Identify yourself." "Help, we're at the old ranger station on Isle Royale. Something attacked us. Our friend is missing," Tom blurted out. "Stay where you are. We're dispatching a team," the voice replied. Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. Suddenly, the door burst open. Not rescuers, the creature. It had tracked us. It lunged at Tom, who tried to fend it off with a rusted fire poker. "Get Lisa out of here," he shouted. I grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her toward the back door. "We can't leave him," she protested. We don't have a choice. As we stumbled outside, a gunshot rang out. Startled, we turned to see Tom standing over the creature, a flare gun in his hands. The beast writhed on the floor, momentarily incapacitated. Didn't think that would actually work, Tom said, breathing heavily. We didn't waste time celebrating. Together, we ran toward the shoreline, hoping to signal any passing boats. Reaching the water's edge, we waved frantically as a ferry appeared in the distance. Behind us, the creature emerged once more, smoke still rising from its singed fur. It was wounded but relentless. "Keep going," Tom urged. As the ferry drew closer, a group of park rangers aboard spotted us and the creature. They shouted orders we couldn't make out, but their raised rifles were a welcome sight. A volley of shots rang out. The creature let out a final, agonized howl before collapsing. The rangers escorted us onto the ferry. One of them, a stern-looking woman named Officer Delgado, questioned us about the incident. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "We've had reports of missing hikers, but nothing concrete until now." "What was that thing?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Delgado exchanged glances with her team. "We've got some theories, but nothing official. The island has its secrets." Back on the mainland, we gave our statements to the authorities. They assured us they'd investigate further, but something in their eyes told me they weren't expecting to find anything. A week later, news reports surfaced about the discovery of remains on Isle Royale, bones that didn't quite match any known species. Experts were baffled, speculating everything from undiscovered wildlife to elaborate hoaxes. As for Max, he was never found. A memorial service was held, but closure remained elusive. In the end, the island was closed to the public indefinitely. Official statements cited environmental concerns, but we knew better. I returned to city life, as the noise and crowds now a strange comfort. Occasionally, I'd catch myself scanning the headlines, looking for any mention of unexplained events in remote places. One day, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a journal, the same one I'd found at the abandoned camp. How it got to me, I had no idea. Attached was a note. "Thought you might want this, Officer Delgado." Flipping through the pages, I noticed new entries in handwriting that wasn't mine. They detailed sightings of creatures across various national parks, all eerily similar to what we'd encountered. It seemed the island wasn't the only place hiding secrets. I closed the journal and stared out the window at the cityscape. Maybe isolation wasn't the escape I thought it would be. My name is Austin Gibson. I'm 42 years old, and I swear on everything I have left that what happened in Apalachicola National Forest was real. I don't drink anymore. I can't, because every time I do, I see that thing's face grinning back at me in the dark. I drove my old RV into the forest a few years ago, thinking I needed some time alone after the divorce. I wasn't sleeping much. My hands shook if I wasn't holding a beer. My ex-wife Lisa said I needed help, but what I needed was space. Silence. So I packed up took a few cases of whiskey, and drove out to the deepest part of Apalachicola, where no one would bother me. The road was bad, worse than I expected. The deeper I went, the more the trees closed in, thick moss hanging from the branches like dead fingers. I didn't see another car for miles. That's how I wanted it. Just me, the swamp, and enough liquor to make me forget why I was out there in the first place. I found a clearing near the water and parked. No cell service, no radio reception, just the sound of frogs and the occasional rustling in the brush. The air was thick, humid as hell, and the sun was already sinking. The first thing that went wrong was the RV's battery. I killed the engine, went outside to take a leak, and when I came back, the lights wouldn't turn on. No power, no reason for it either. The damn thing had been fine all the way there. I figured I'd deal with it in the morning. That night, I sat by the fire, drinking, trying not to think about Lisa or the divorce, or the fact that I had nowhere to go when I got back. Then the knocking started. Soft, like fingertips against the metal. I turned my head slowly toward the RV. Nothing. Probably a branch, I told myself. Or an animal. I went inside, locking the door behind me. I lay down on the small cot, listening. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the other side now, near the back window. I grabbed my flashlight and yanked open the curtain. Nothing but darkness. I shut the curtain, turned over, and tried to sleep. At some point in the night, the radio turned on. It hadn't worked in years. The damn thing was busted, fried from an old battery issue. But now it crackled with static. And through it, a song started playing. Lisa used to love that song. But the lyrics were wrong. The voice singing was off, slow, stretched, like someone mimicking a record player at half speed. I yanked the power knob. The music stopped. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went outside to check the engine. That's when I saw the footprints. Not mine. They circled the RV, stopping right outside my window. Bare footprints, too long, like the toes had been stretched out. I told myself it was some local screwing with me, someone trying to scare me off. I decided I'd had enough of that spot, so I packed up to leave. Got in the driver's seat, turned the key. Nothing. The RV wouldn't start. I opened the hood, checked the wires. Everything looked fine, but it was like the engine was just dead, like the damn thing had given up. I was stuck. That's when I saw the man in the trees, far off, just standing between the pines, his head tilted, watching me. I called out, but he didn't move. I took a step forward. "Hey, buddy, you lost?" He took a step back, fading into the shadows. I ran toward where he had been, but by the time I got there, the trees were empty. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I went back to camp, locking myself in the RV even though I knew that wouldn't do much. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix the engine, trying to find some rational explanation. Then the knocking came back. But this time, it was coming from the door. I froze. Knock, knock, knock. I swallowed hard, gripping the handle of my knife. Who's there? Silence. Then a voice. Low calm. "Danny." My breath hitched. "Lisa." I backed away from the door. The handle rattled. "Danny, let me in." My hands shook. My head felt light. I hadn't spoken to Lisa in weeks. She wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I peeked out the window. She was standing there. Lisa, in the blue dress she wore the night she left me. Her hair down. Her lips curled in that soft little smile she used to give me when we were happy. I squeezed my eyes shut. I was hallucinating. The booze, the stress, that was all it was. When I opened my eyes, she was closer, right outside the window, smiling, too wide, her lips curled back, revealing too many teeth. I screamed and threw myself back. The knocking stopped. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to hike out. No matter how far I walked, I always ended up back at the RV. By sunset, I was losing my mind. Then the park ranger showed up. He came walking down the path like nothing was wrong, clipboard in hand. "You lost, sir?" I ran up to him. "Jesus, man, you gotta help me. My RV's dead. Then I saw his badge. Holloway, my last name. I stepped back. "What the hell?" He just smiled. "You're not supposed to be here, Danny." I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, but no matter which way I went, I always ended up back at that damn RV. That night, the radio came on again. This time, it wasn't music. It was a voice, deep, laughing. "You're almost ready to let go." I covered my ears. "Shut up. Shut the hell up." The mirror in the RV cracked, and my own face smiled back at me. "Danny," it whispered. "You know why she left." I backed away, shaking. No. You were driving drunk. The air went out of my lungs. "You crashed." I shook my head. No, she left me." My reflection grinned wider. She didn't leave. She never left. And then I remembered. The rain that night, the headlights spinning, the crunch of metal. I never called the cops. I passed out, woke up in the wreckage, stumbled home, convinced myself she'd just left. But she was still out there, somewhere in the swamp, buried. I fell to my knees, my head in my hands. The voice whispered in my ear, "You can stay here, Danny, or you can let go." I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed the bottle of whiskey and smashed it against the RV's floor. I lit a match. The fire spread fast. The voice screamed. The last thing I saw before I passed out, Lisa, standing in the flames, smiling. I woke up on the side of the road. My truck was there. The road was dry. The sky was clear. I drove out of that forest and never looked back. But sometimes, at night, I hear the knocking, and when I look in the mirror, I see my own face, smiling back. My name is Randy Smith, and back in 2018, I decided to take my RV up to Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario for some peace and quiet. Being cooped up in the city was starting to make me feel like a sardine in a can, and I figured some fresh air might do me good. Besides, I've always believed that nature and I have an understanding. I don't bother it, and it doesn't bother me. I've never been the rugged outdoorsman type. My idea of hiking involves a well-marked trail and a picnic at the end. but the allure of the open road and the promise of solitude were too tempting to pass up. So I packed my essentials, a week's worth of snacks, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The drive was picturesque, with the trees flaunting their autumn colors like they were showing off. By the time I reached the park, the sun was casting golden hues over the lake, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I found a secluded spot near the water, set up camp, and made myself a cup of coffee. This isn't so bad, I thought. Maybe I should write a book, Randy's Adventures in the Wild. As dusk settled, I decided to light a campfire. There's something hypnotic about watching flames dance. It's like nature's television. I was roasting marshmallows, because what's a camping trip without s'mores? When I heard footsteps crunching leaves behind me. "Evening," a voice said. I turned to see a man standing at the edge of my campsite. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd been through a war zone. His eyes had a peculiar glint, one that made me instinctively uneasy. "Evening," I replied cautiously. "Can I help you with something?" "Just passing through," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Jedediah, but folks call me Jed." "Randy," I offered, though he hadn't asked. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" He stepped closer, eyeing the marshmallows. "Sure is. Mind if I join you for a bit?" Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, but I didn't want to be rude. Actually, I was just about to turn in, long drive and all. He tilted his head, the smile fading. "Fair enough. You take care now." "Will do," I said, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Well, that wasn't creepy at all," I muttered, deciding it was indeed time to call it a night. I extinguished the fire and secured the RV. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of pine. I convinced myself that I'd overreacted the night before. Maybe Jed was just a harmless drifter. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail. I left a note on the dashboard, a habit from watching too many true crime shows, grabbed my backpack, and set off. The trail was serene, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and leaves crunching underfoot. I was about an hour in when I noticed something odd, a campsite just off the path. But it looked abandoned. Curious, I ventured closer. Tents were collapsed, and belongings were strewn about as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Unease settled in my stomach. This is how people end up in horror movies, I joked nervously to myself. I decided to head back. As I turned, I nearly bumped into Jed. "Whoa, you startled me," I exclaimed. "Sorry about that," he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "What brings you here?" "Just hiking," I replied, trying to sound casual. "You?" "Same," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "Shame about what happened here." "Yeah, looks like they left in a hurry," he chuckled softly. "Or something made them leave." I swallowed hard. "Well, I should get going." "Don't let me keep you," he said, stepping aside. I walked briskly back to the trail, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. By the time I reached my RV, my heart was pounding. Maybe it's time to move on to another site, I thought. I started packing up when I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, half expecting Jed, but it was another man, this one wearing a park ranger uniform. "Sorry to startle you," he said. "I'm Ranger Thompson, just making my rounds." "Oh, thank goodness," I sighed in relief. "Randy Farnsworth. Everything all right? You look a bit shaken." I debated whether to mention Jed, but decided I might sound paranoid. "Just had an odd encounter earlier. Do you know a man named Jedediah around here?" The ranger's expression darkened. "Jedediah Clark?" "Yeah, goes by Jed." He nodded grimly. "We've had reports about him. I'd advise you to be cautious. He's not well." "Not well how?" I pressed. "Look, it's probably best if you relocate to a more populated area of the park," he suggested. "Safety in numbers." "Understood," I said, feeling a knot in my stomach. "Thanks for the warning." As he left, I hurried to finish packing. Just as I was about to start the engine, I realized I'd left my map on the picnic table. I stepped out to grab it, when something heavy struck me from behind. Everything went black. I awoke to a splitting headache and found myself tied to a chair inside what looked like an old cabin. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting eerie shadows on the walls adorned with hunting trophies. "Rise and shine?" came Jed's voice from the darkness. "What do you want?" I demanded, struggling against the ropes. He stepped into the light, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Company. Is that too much to ask? Kidnapping isn't exactly the way to make friends," I retorted. He laughed. "Oh, but we're past pleasantries now. Look, if it's money you want—" "Money?" he interrupted. "You think this is about money? No, all this is about survival." "Survival?" He began pacing. "City folks like you come here thinking you own the place, leaving your trash, making noise, disrupting the balance. I'm sorry if I—" "Too late for apologies," he snapped. "You and your kind are a blight." "You're not making any sense," I said, trying to keep him talking while I worked at the knots. He pulled out a hunting knife, examining it thoughtfully. "Sense? Sense is living off the land, respecting its laws, not hiding in metal boxes on wheels." "Okay, noted. I'll just be on my way and promise to leave nature untouched," I said. He shook his head slowly. "Can't let you do that." Before I could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. "Jedediah Clark, this is Ranger Thompson. Open up!" Jed's eyes flickered with rage. "You just couldn't stay quiet, could you?" As he moved toward the door, adrenaline surged through me. I managed to loosen the ropes enough to free one hand. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy wooden stool and waited. As Jed turned back, I swung with all my might. The stool connected with his shoulder, causing him to drop the knife and stumble. "You little," he growled. I didn't wait for him to finish. I bolted for the back door, bursting into the cool night air. My RV was parked nearby, and I sprinted toward it, fumbling with the keys. As I jumped inside and started the engine, I saw Jed appear in the side mirror, fury etched on his face. I didn't look back. Later, I learned that Jed had been evading capture for months. He was a former survivalist who lost his grip on reality after a tragic accident claimed his family. As for me, next time someone suggests a nature trip, I'll politely decline. I'm outdoorsy, in that I like having drinks on patios. My name is Austin Gibson, and this happened back in 2011 in Shawnee National Forest, Illinois, when I first took a temporary ranger job there to help with the busy fall season. Never suspecting I'd leave that place with shaking hands and a heart full of questions. I remember stepping into that small ranger station around late September, feeling pretty good because I'd managed to snag a cheap motel room in town that morning. I had a bland cheese sandwich for breakfast, just something out of the convenience store freezer section, and washed it down with watery coffee. I wore a faded uniform passed down from a previous hire who'd left mustard stains near the left pocket. It smelled like stale sweat and cheap detergent, but I was just glad to have work. I was 25, broke, and eager to prove myself reliable. I liked the quiet of the forest trails, the dense maples and oaks, and the smell of damp leaves after last week's rain. We had a small team, just me and two others on rotation that day. Tom, older and with a bushy beard that he tied with a rubber band, always joked about his ex-wife and how her new husband sold fancy lawnmowers. And Gina, in her early 40s, usually wore a baseball cap over short-cropped hair. She had a habit of humming some old tune I couldn't place whenever she got nervous. She'd say, "Pat, you know that feeling when you think the woods are just a bit too still?" I didn't know what she meant back then. I thought forests were supposed to be quiet. That morning, Gina handed me a radio and said, "Don't wander off without checking in. It's not summer camp season, but we still get the odd hiker." By noon, I was on a trail known as Pine Hollow Path, which, despite the name, had more oaks than pines. The canopy let through thin beams of light, and the forest floor was scattered with red and brown leaves. I came across a half-eaten energy bar wrapper on the path, which struck me as odd because we usually lectured visitors about leaving no trash. I stuffed it in my pocket. About an hour later, I stumbled on something far more disturbing, a torn jacket sleeve snagged on a low branch. It looked recent, maybe a day old, and the fabric was stiff with something dark. I didn't want to think about it. That's when I radioed Tom. "Hey, Found a torn piece of clothing. Could be a lost hiker. Anything on the logs? Tom answered with a yawn. We had a party of 3 who checked in yesterday. They should have been out by now. That sent a chill into my chest, and I began scanning the underbrush with more care. I followed a faint trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves off the main path. About 20 feet in, I smelled something unpleasant, like old meat left out on a warm countertop. I advanced slowly, heart tapping at my ribs. In a small clearing behind a fallen tree, I found the body of a man. He looked about 40, wearing a hiking vest and boots. His left arm lay twisted at a strange angle, and part of his torso had been torn open. The sight made my stomach lurch. I stepped back, pressed my hand against my mouth, and tried to breathe through it. Then I spoke into the radio with forced calm. "Tom," I said, "I've got a deceased male hiker here. Looks like an animal attack." Gina broke in, her voice uneasy. "Animal attacks are rare here. Are you sure?" I didn't answer her. I just gave them my coordinates. While I waited, I squatted down, thinking maybe the poor guy slipped and got mauled by a coyote or something. But coyotes don't usually leave bodies like that. I took in the surroundings, noticing deep scratches on a nearby tree trunk, higher than my shoulders. There was a pattern, something I couldn't quite place. But it definitely wasn't from a raccoon or a bobcat. When Tom and Gina arrived, they were both grim-faced. Tom tried to hide his shock. Gina stopped humming. She just stared and shook her head. We decided to search for the other 2 hikers from that party of 3. Tom radioed the station to call for authorities. We couldn't just leave, not with the possibility of survivors. We moved deeper into the woods, spreading out but staying close enough to yell if something happened. I remember wiping sweat off my forehead, even though it wasn't that hot. The silence weighed on me. Sometimes a branch cracked underfoot, and I jumped. Then we found another body. This time, it was a woman, slumped against a boulder. Her pack was gone, her face frozen in a look of pain. She had similar wounds, and the ground around her was stained and scattered with damp leaves. I wish I hadn't eaten that cheese sandwich earlier. "Hello? Anybody out here?" I called. No answer. I heard Tom whisper, "This is bad, Pat." I nodded, my mouth dry. Gina, who walked a short distance away, suddenly shouted, "Found footprints!" We hurried over. There were large impressions in the soft earth, bigger than any mountain lion print I'd seen in guides. They looked like a cat's, but heavier. Deeper. "A cougar?" Tom asked. Gina shrugged. "Not impossible, but..." She trailed off. Something about these tracks bothered her. They showed long strides, more powerful than what we expected. We decided to keep searching for the 3rd hiker. The afternoon light was fading, and we had to use flashlights. Being out there as dusk approached set me on edge. I found myself talking just to break the tension. "Tom, remember that big raccoon we saw by the dumpsters yesterday?" Tom grunted. I tried a lame joke. "If that raccoon shows up now, I'll offer him my last candy bar to watch our backs." No one laughed. Then, at twilight, we heard a scream, quick and sharp. We ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks. We found the 3rd hiker, alive at first. A young guy in his 20s, holding his side, crouched under a half-fallen tree. "Help!" he shouted, voice cracking. We rushed over, flashlights jumping. He looked terrified, eyes darting behind us as if expecting something to pounce. "It took them. It's out here." He didn't have to say more. We heard heavy steps in the brush, a soft rustling that made my skin prickle. We formed a semicircle around the wounded hiker, shining our beams into the dark trees. I saw a shape then, low and muscular, moving between trunks. No distinct silhouette, just movement. My heart thundered. Then it rushed forward. I could barely describe its form. A cat-like body, maybe 5 feet long, thick shoulders, dark fur that blended with the night. It moved quietly, at first, then thump! It slammed into the injured hiker. He screamed. We shouted, shining lights into its face. I saw powerful jaws flash open and close. The man's screams turned into choking gasps. I stepped forward, but Tom grabbed my shoulder. "Pat, no. It's too late." Gina swung her flashlight at the creature's head, and it hissed, a strange, sharp sound. Then it ran off into the darkness, leaving the man on the ground. He was gone. And that was only the beginning. We knelt beside him. He was gone. It had ended his life in seconds. Gina cursed under her breath. Tom looked like he might cry. I felt sick again, kneeling there, trying to hold my flashlight steady. Now we had 3 dead hikers, a killer animal somewhere in the woods, and night pressing in on all sides. We made a plan to retreat to the station. The radio crackled as we tried to call for backup. Spotty reception. "We need the phone," I said. Tom nodded. We hurried back along the trail, our flashlights bouncing over tree trunks and roots. Gina whispered, "Don't run. Running sets it off." We moved briskly but tried to look calm, which was impossible. I gripped my radio so hard my knuckles hurt. Halfway back, we realized something was keeping pace with us. Branches snapped lightly. I tried to catch a glimpse but only saw shifting silhouettes. We picked up speed. "I'll buy us all dinner if we get out of this," I muttered. No one responded. I suppose we all wanted to pretend we were anywhere else, maybe at a diner with French fries and milkshakes, not stuck in the dark with a vicious predator. At one point, Tom lagged behind to catch his breath. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll be right there." Gina and I stopped, turned back. "Don't be stupid," she said. "We stick together." He nodded and lumbered forward, chest heaving. He was bigger than me, maybe 50 pounds heavier, and the fear weighed on him. We formed a tight group, shining lights in every direction. The woods smelled damp and earthy, and every sound set me on edge. We reached a fork in the path. By then, I noticed fresh scratches on the bark of a large oak, long, parallel marks, too clean to be random. We heard a sudden snapping of twigs and spun around. The creature rushed past our lights so fast I barely saw more than a dark shape. Tom shouted, "There!" but it moved in a blur. Gina and I tried to stand back to back with him. We breathed in quick, shallow gasps. I held a length of sturdy branch I'd picked up, though I doubted it would help much. A moment passed, maybe less. Then it struck again, hitting Tom this time. I swung the branch wildly, hitting only air. I saw Tom on the ground, coughing, struggling. Gina screamed at me to help him. I knelt and tried to pull him up. His chest and shoulder were torn, and his hands shook as he reached for me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I tried to stop the bleeding with my jacket, but it was too much. His eyes fluttered. I pleaded, "Come on, Tom. Don't leave me here, man." He said nothing else. Gina stood guard, flashlight shaking in her grip. The forest was too silent again. After a minute, I realized Tom was gone. My eyes stung with tears. I swallowed hard and said, "Gina, we have to run." We ran. I know I said not to run earlier, but we had no choice. Our boots pounded the dirt. The station wasn't far. The creature crashed through the brush behind us, keeping pace. My lungs burned, and my mind spun. I tried to recall if there was a service rifle locked at the station. Maybe. Maybe not. Anything would help. Gina was ahead of me, her flashlight beam shaking. We broke through the last stand of trees and saw the faint light from the station's bulb. I fumbled for the door, keys rattling. Inside, I slammed it shut and pushed a heavy cabinet against it. Gina collapsed into a chair, gasping. "We lost Tom," she said flatly. I nodded, pressing my forehead against the door. We tried the landline phone, static. We tried the radio, no immediate response. Maybe the call had gone out earlier and help was on the way. Maybe not. While Gina searched for a first aid kit, I peered out a small window. Nothing but darkness and the suggestion of trees. I listened hard, hearing only the hum of the station's small fridge. There was a box of flares on a shelf, and I pulled one out, thinking maybe we could signal someone. I waited, half expecting the animal to burst in. But it didn't. Hours passed. Gina stayed quiet. I remember rummaging through a drawer and finding a half-eaten bag of pretzels. My throat was too tight to swallow. As the first hint of dawn broke, we dared to open the door a crack. The forest looked normal, dew on leaves. Pale light filtering through. No sign of the creature. No strange prints by the door. Nothing. We stepped outside, tense, every sense sharpened. We didn't talk about going back to look for the bodies. We just knew we had to get the proper authorities and show them. We found a ranger truck behind the station, old, but it ran. Gina drove while I clutched the flare gun. My hands trembled with every bump in the dirt road. We made it out. But we carried what we saw inside our minds. When the sheriff's deputies and wildlife officers arrived later that day, they searched in teams. rifles ready. They found the bodies. They found unusual tracks. But I never heard a confident explanation. Maybe a rogue predator wandered in from another region. Maybe something escaped from a private collector's estate. I don't know. Gina and I never got a satisfying answer. They patrolled heavily for weeks. Nothing else turned up. Eventually, people said it must have been a one-time tragedy. I still think about it. I still see that creature's eyes in the beam of my flashlight. Sometimes I wonder if it slipped away to another stretch of forest, still hungry, still waiting to surprise someone. I can't shake that thought. Even today, when I step outside at dusk, I pause and listen harder than I did before, just in case. My name is Logan Cooper, and this happened to me on September 14th, 1994. I've been a search and rescue officer for almost 2 decades now. I've seen a lot, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the fall of '88. It was one of those years when the forest seemed to breathe easier, the air crisp and cool, the leaves transforming into a kaleidoscope of red, orange, and yellow. Most of my days were spent patrolling the trails and helping lost hikers find their way back. It was a job I loved, one that gave me a sense of purpose and connection to nature. It started as a regular Friday. I was in the ranger station, sipping on a cup of coffee, the kind that's more bitter than soothing, when the call came in. A family reported their teenage son missing. They were camping in the dense woods of the Cascade Range, near a spot we locals called Blackwood Hollow. It wasn't a popular area. In fact, it was pretty remote, which made it all the more concerning. The boy, Kyle Thompson, had been missing for nearly 12 hours. I grabbed my gear, radioed my partner Rick, and we headed out. Rick was a good guy, a bit younger than me, with a sharp mind and quick wit. We joked about how every rescue mission felt like we were stepping into an old western, with us as the cowboys riding into the unknown. We reached Blackwood Hollow by late afternoon. The place had an eerie calm to it, a stillness that seemed to swallow sound. We met Kyle's parents at their campsite. They were frantic, the mother on the verge of tears, the father pacing like a caged animal. They explained that Kyle had wandered off the previous night, saying he was going to explore, but he never came back. Rick and I started our search, moving in a grid pattern, calling out Kyle's name. We had a good system, years of experience between us. As dusk settled, the forest grew darker, and our flashlights barely cut through the thickening gloom. There's something about the woods at night that gets under your skin, makes you feel like you're being watched. About an hour in, we found Kyle's backpack. It was lying at the base of a massive oak tree, partially covered in leaves. Inside were typical teenage things: a flashlight, some snacks, a notebook, but no sign of Kyle. We pressed on, our shouts becoming more urgent. Then we heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was hard to pinpoint, but it was there. We followed the sound, moving quickly now, the urgency driving us forward. The cries led us deeper into the forest, to a part I wasn't familiar with. The trees were denser, the path narrower. It felt like we were being funneled into a trap. We came upon a clearing, and there, in the middle, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, windows shattered, roof caved in. The cries were louder now, coming from inside. Rick and I exchanged a look. This wasn't right, but we had to find Kyle. We approached the cabin cautiously, flashlights sweeping the area. I called out, "Kyle, you in there?" No response, just the continued whimpering. We pushed the door open and the smell hit us first, damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic. Blood. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture overturned, debris everywhere. In the corner, we saw him, Kyle, huddled and trembling, eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't alone. Standing over him was a figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Before we could react, the figure lunged at Rick, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. Rick went down, and I barely had time to draw my knife. I slashed at the figure, connecting with something solid. It hissed, a sound that made my skin crawl, and retreated into the shadows. I grabbed Kyle, pulling him to his feet. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted out of the cabin. Rick was on the ground, clutching his side but alive. We made it to the clearing before I dared to look back. The figure was standing in the doorway, watching us, but it didn't follow. We helped Rick up, and with Kyle between us, we made our way back to the campsite as fast as we could. The whole time, I felt like we were being hunted, the trees closing in around us. But we didn't stop, didn't look back, until we were safely at the ranger station. Kyle's parents were relieved, their gratitude evident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Rick was taken to the hospital, his wound deep but not life-threatening. I stayed behind, trying to piece together what had happened. The authorities were called, and a search was conducted. But the cabin was never found. Kyle's memory was hazy, filled with fragments of a nightmare he couldn't fully recall. He mentioned being lured by a voice, something that seemed human but wasn't. Weeks passed, and the incident was quietly swept under the rug. Officially, it was chalked up to a bear attack, though anyone who'd seen the wounds knew better. Rick recovered, but he left the job soon after. Said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I stayed on, but Blackwood Hollow became a place I avoided. The forest felt different, like it had secrets best left undisturbed. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes hear that faint cry, a reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows of our world. Years later, the memory still haunts me. Not just the encounter, but the sense of helplessness. The realization that there are things out there beyond our understanding. Kyle grew up, moved away, tried to forget. But I couldn't. It became a part of me, a shadow that followed wherever I went. One night, I was having a beer with an old friend, Jason. He was another ranger, one who had his own stories of the strange and unexplainable. We were sitting on my porch watching the stars when I finally told him about that night in Blackwood Hollow. He listened, a thoughtful look on his face, then nodded. "I've heard similar stories," he said. "Different places, different faces, but the same kind of presence. Some say it's a spirit. Others think it's something more primal, more ancient." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It didn't bring me comfort, but it felt good to share the burden, to know I wasn't alone in my experience. Life went on, as it does. I kept doing my job, helping those lost in the wilderness, always with a cautious eye on the tree line. I never went back to Blackwood Hollow, and neither did Rick. It became one of those places with a story attached, a whispered legend among the rangers. In the end, I think that's what it was, a legend, something that exists on the edges of our reality, only revealing itself when we stray too far into the unknown. And maybe that's for the best. Some things are meant to remain hidden, their mysteries left unsolved. I still wonder about that night, about what I saw and what might have happened if we hadn't escaped. It's a question that lingers, unanswered, a reminder of the thin line between our world and whatever lies beyond. And as long as I'm alive, I'll carry that memory with me, a testament to the things we'll never fully understand. It all started with an offhand joke. You hear enough bad jokes in my line of work, but this one stood out. It was 2004, somewhere deep in the North Carolina woods, the kind of place tourists don't even know exists. I had been on 100 missions before, but this one seemed simple. Find the locals who had gone missing and bring them back, dead or alive. I joined the Green Berets for the adrenaline, for the chance to do something meaningful. But over the years, that rush started to fade, until that damn joke. Some of the local cops, the ones I was meant to coordinate with, had this thing where they'd whisper around me like they were afraid to say something out loud. One of them, a big guy named Remy, who always chewed tobacco and spat on his own boots, leaned in one night while I was cleaning my rifle and said, "The woods don't like strangers much. They got their own rules. And yeah, sometimes they eat folks who break them." I remember rolling my eyes and grunting something about old wives' tales, but it stuck with me. I mean, I'd been through enough to know that when locals get weird, there's usually a reason. So I took it as a heads up, though I didn't believe in superstitions. Not then, anyway. By the time we got out there, Me, Remy, and a few other locals we picked up, the sun was slipping low behind the trees, giving us just enough time to set up a base camp. I didn't like the idea of working with the local guys, especially Remy, who cracked more jokes than a man should, but orders are orders. One of them, Pete, had lived out here all his life. He swore he'd seen bears doing strange things, but I didn't pay it much mind. Bears don't take people whole, and they sure as hell don't drag them away without leaving a mess. Remy, Pete, and I split up to cover more ground. Remy took the creek bed. Pete took the ridge above it. That left me with the thickest part of the woods where the trees leaned in close like a suffocating crowd. I could feel the humidity seeping through my clothes. The air smelled like pine and something rotten underneath. It wasn't long before I found my first clue. A bloody shirt, half buried under a pile of leaves. Like something had tried to hide it, but didn't care to do it right. The thing about finding blood is, it's never a good sign. But this wasn't the splatter of a struggle or the spray you get when something big goes down. No, this was something else. Methodical. I pressed on, radioing Remy and Pete every 15 minutes like we'd planned. No answers, but I could hear faint static, just enough to know the radios weren't dead. It's just that they weren't responding. By dusk, I found more. Pieces of a tent, torn like they'd been shredded by claws, though not the kind you'd expect. No signs of struggle, no trap, just a creeping sense that something was off. Then I found the bones. Not scattered, not chewed, laid out in a pattern. Deliberate, like someone had taken their time setting them out, like a child making a stick figure in the dirt. There was no mistaking it. Human. I cracked another joke over the radio, something dumb about arts and crafts, but got nothing back. The silence sat heavy, but I pushed on. Maybe they were messing with me, trying to scare the new guy from out of town. That's when I heard it. A snapping sound. Low to the ground, like someone or something. Breaking branches. I kept my rifle at the ready and pushed through a thicket. That's when I spotted Remy's body, or at least what was left of it. Slumped against a tree, his guts spilled out like someone had unzipped him. There was no sign of Pete. I didn't get close enough to see much more, because of what stood over Remy's corpse. It looked like a wolf. If wolves walked on two legs, its fur was matted, dripping with blood that wasn't its own. Its teeth, longer, thinner than they should be, gleamed in the dim light. It didn't look right. Didn't move right. My first thought was that maybe it was a man. Some freaky local in a getup, trying to scare me. But then it crouched low, sniffing at the air, and I knew better. This thing wasn't interested in me, at least not yet. I dropped down, hoping the thick brush would hide me. My breath came out in short bursts. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might hear me. I didn't have a clean shot. And this wasn't the kind of thing you wanted to miss. I watched it turn its head, almost like it was listening for something. Then it stood up and started walking toward the trees. Its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and I got the impression that whatever it was, it didn't belong in a world that made sense. I waited until it was far enough, then crawled back to where Remy lay, took what was left of his radio, and tried to call for backup. Static. Just static. Pete still wasn't responding either. I thought about turning back to camp, but I couldn't leave without knowing what happened to Pete. Maybe he found a way out. Maybe he was just lost in the dark. Or maybe he wasn't. I found Pete an hour later, hanging from a tree, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Below him, more bones. Some fresh, some old. There was a skull, cracked open like a walnut, and for the first time in my life, I was scared in a way I hadn't been, even when bullets were flying. This wasn't just about some missing folks anymore. This was a burial ground, a damn feeding ground. I've seen death before, but not like this, not methodical, not like a ritual. I radioed again, whispering this time, as if keeping my voice low might make me less real to whatever was out there. My rifle felt heavy, useless, but I kept it clutched in my hands like a lifeline. I needed to find a way back, but then I heard that same snapping sound, closer this time. It didn't come from the ground. It came from above. That's when I saw them. More of those things. climbing through the treetops like giant bats, their limbs twisting around branches like they had extra joints. There were at least 3 of them, but they moved so fast I couldn't keep count. I stayed perfectly still, hoping they'd miss me, but one of them leapt down, landing in front of me with a soft thud, like a cat dropping from a fence. I didn't think. I fired, 3 rounds into its chest. It staggered back, but the thing didn't go down. It shrieked. Not like an animal, not like anything I had ever heard. A kind of sound that drilled into your skull and rattled around in your head. But it bled, and that gave me a sliver of hope. I fired again, aiming for its head, and this time it dropped, twitching on the ground like a dying fish. The others noticed. They dropped from the trees, their claws scraping bark as they hit the ground. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life, and I didn't look back, not even when I heard them crashing through the underbrush behind me. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were tearing apart, but I ran until I stumbled into a clearing and saw the lights of a cabin up ahead. I crashed through the door, slamming it shut behind me. An old man sat in a rickety chair by the fireplace, staring at me like I had just interrupted his dinner. He didn't seem surprised to see a soldier covered in blood, carrying a smoking rifle. He just looked at me, his expression flat, like he was watching a rerun of a TV show he'd seen 1,000 times before. I asked him if he had a phone, a radio, anything. He just shook his head and said, "They come for what they want, and then they leave. Always have." He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared past me, like he was looking through the walls. He started talking about the woods like they were alive, about how sometimes the forest decides who stays and who goes. I didn't have time for his riddles. I barricaded the windows, checked my ammunition, and asked him if he knew a way out. He just laughed. This low, gravelly sound that echoed in the small room. "You don't get out, son. You just survive." And then he went quiet, staring into the flames as if that was all that mattered. I watched through the window as the things circled the cabin, their silhouettes barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight. One of them came closer, dragging something behind it. Pete's body. It left him just outside, like bait. That's when I made my decision. I grabbed a lantern and the last of my ammunition and told the old man to stay inside. He just nodded like he'd heard it all before. I stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a slap. They were waiting, their heads cocked to one side, like they were curious, like they wanted to see what I'd do. I lit the lantern, smashed it against the cabin wall, and watched as the flames leapt up, catching on the dry wood. I figured if I couldn't get out, I'd take them down with me. The fire spread fast, crackling through the walls, but the creatures didn't flinch. They just watched as the flames consumed the cabin. That's when I realized the old man wasn't just resigned. He was one of them, or something like them, part of whatever lived out there in the woods. I shot at one of the creatures, catching it in the leg. It stumbled, but didn't go down. The others lunged. I fought like hell, but they were faster. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting it until I heard the snap. I dropped to the ground, fighting the pain as I clawed for my rifle, but they knocked it out of reach. Then they stopped. One of them let out a high-pitched yelp, and the others retreated into the shadows as if called back. I lay there, panting, my vision swimming. And then I saw it, their leader, standing on 2 legs, staring at me with something like curiosity. It leaned down close, sniffing the air, and then it turned and loped off into the trees, dragging Pete's body with it. I don't know why they left me alive. Maybe it was some twisted game. Maybe it was their way of letting me deliver the message. But as I lay there, staring up at the burning cabin, I realized what the old man meant. You don't get out. You just survive. And they let you remember. By dawn, a search party found me. They didn't find the old man, and they sure as hell didn't find Pete. They asked me what happened, but I didn't give them any answers they'd believe. They patched me up, got me out of the woods, and that was that. I left without saying a word. I got out, sure. But sometimes I think about Remy, about Pete, about what those things really are. Part animal, part nightmare. Maybe they were here long before us, just waiting for the woods to change back to the way they liked it. And then I heard the final joke from one of the locals, the one that almost made me laugh. Maybe the woods just didn't like your joke, stranger. My name is Timothy Perez. I was 27 years old when it happened. I don't tell this story because I want to. I tell it because I need to. People need to know what's out there, what's hiding in the places the maps call wild and empty. I used to think nothing scared me. I don't think that anymore. It was supposed to be a week-long RV trip through Florida's backwoods. Just me, my girlfriend Lisa, my best friend Tommy, and his buddy Trevor. We had planned it for months, an escape from the city, from our jobs, from reality. Tate's Hell State Forest sounded perfect. Isolated, beautiful, untouched. A little too untouched, as we would soon learn. The trouble started before we even reached our campsite. We were deep in the forest when the RV jolted violently, throwing Lisa against the window. The sound of crunching metal and hissing air followed. I slammed on the brakes. "What the hell was that?" Tommy asked, his hands gripping the dashboard. I jumped out to check. The front tire was shredded, destroyed by a row of rusted nails hidden beneath a layer of leaves and mud. Someone had put them there. "This isn't normal," Lisa muttered, standing beside me. Her auburn hair clung to her face in the humid air, her green eyes scanning the trees like they were watching her back. "Who the hell booby-traps a road?" "Poachers," Tommy guessed. "Or just some wanting to mess with tourists." Trevor, the quietest of us, crouched near the tire. "We're stuck." He wasn't wrong. We had no cell service, no spare, and no way to call for help. The nearest ranger station was a long, miserable hike away. I suggested we camp for the night and figure it out in the morning. Everyone agreed, though Lisa looked uneasy. That night, things got worse. It started with the noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. But it wasn't. I heard whispers, low, breathy voices, laughter, the kind of laughter that didn't belong. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, gripping my arm. "Yeah," I admitted. Tommy unzipped the tent. "The hell is out there?" Trevor was already up, staring into the darkness. "Footsteps," he murmured. "Barefoot. We found the prints in the morning. Large, human, but wrong, too long, too narrow, like someone had been walking on the edges of their feet. They circled our campsite, never coming closer than a few yards. Then we found the doll. It was sitting on a log near the fire pit, a small, crude thing made of sticks and twine, its mouth sewn shut with what looked like human hair. Lisa refused to touch it. No, this is some Blair Witch." Trevor picked it up, inspecting the dark stains on its arms. Dried blood. We should have left then. But we didn't. We were arrogant. We thought we could handle it. That afternoon, Trevor went missing. He said he was going to take a leak and never came back. At first, we laughed it off, thinking he was messing with us. But when an hour passed, we started searching. We found his flashlight lying in the dirt. The lens cracked. His footprints stopped suddenly, like he had been lifted off the ground. Lisa wanted to leave. Tommy agreed. I told them we had to find Trevor first, and then he came back. It was just before sunset when he walked into camp. His clothes were dirty, his face blank. "Jesus, Trevor, where the hell have you been?" I demanded. "Got lost," he said. His voice was flat. "Wrong." Lisa grabbed my arm and whispered, "That's not Trevor." I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. That night I woke up to whispering. I rolled over and saw Trevor sitting outside the tent, his back to me, mumbling to something I couldn't see. "Trevor?" He turned his head slightly, but not all the way. "Go back to sleep." I didn't. In the morning, Lisa pulled me aside. "Something's wrong with him, Timothy." "Yeah," I admitted. "But what do? We leave. Now." Before we could, Tommy went missing. We searched all day, shouting his name, finding nothing but broken branches and deep, sunken footprints leading into the swamp. "He's gone," Lisa whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Then we heard the scream. It was distant but unmistakable. Tommy. He was alive. He was in trouble. Trevor turned to us, grinning for the first time in days. "We should go after him." Something about the way he said it made my stomach turn. Still, I grabbed a knife and a flashlight, and Lisa followed. We ran toward the sound, deeper into the forest. The air grew thick with the stench of rot. Then we saw the pit. It was a deep hole lined with sharpened sticks. Bones littered the bottom. Human bones. And Tommy was there, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror. Jesus! I jumped down, cutting the ropes around his wrists. Who did this to you? Before he could answer, something hit me. Hard. When I came to, Lisa was screaming. I was tied to a wooden post, my arms wrenched behind my back. Firelight flickered, revealing figures moving through the trees. Thin, half-naked men and women with hollow eyes and sharpened teeth. They grinned at me, their mouths smeared with blood. Cannibals. And standing among them, smiling like he belonged, was Trevor. Trevor, I croaked. He crouched beside me. You shouldn't have come looking for Tommy. I struggled, but the ropes were too tight. Lisa was tied next to me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. You were always the hero, Trevor whispered. Always the one everyone looked up to. But out here, you're nothing. I spat at him. You're insane. He wiped his face and smirked. You'll see. Soon enough. The cult leader approached, his face covered in scars. He muttered something in a language I didn't recognize, then pointed at Lisa. 2 men grabbed her. She screamed. I thrashed against my restraints. No, take me instead. Trevor leaned in. That's not how this works. I did the only thing I could. I bit down on the rope, sawing at it with my teeth. The fibers tore against my tongue. Then I heard Lisa cry out in pain. I snapped. With a final yank, the rope gave. I ripped my arms free and grabbed a burning log from the fire. I swung it into the nearest cannibal's face, the heat peeling skin from bone. Lisa kicked the man holding her. I grabbed a knife from the ground and cut her loose. Then we ran. The cult screamed behind us, their footsteps slamming against the dirt. I didn't look back. Somewhere in the chaos, Trevor shouted, Timothy, wait! I turned and saw him standing at the tree line, his face twisted in something like regret. Please, he begged. I didn't want this. Lisa raised the knife. I hesitated. Then I saw his smile flicker back. I stabbed him in the throat. We found the road just as a truck came around the bend. The driver nearly crashed trying to avoid us. We never spoke to the police. There was nothing to find. No evidence, no bodies, only nightmares. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Trevor. And I wonder if I really killed him.